Is this all right? Okay. Is everyone ready? Judge? I affirm the resolution. Resolved, it is morally permissible for victims to use deadly force as a deliberate response to repeated domestic violence. I define permissible as permitted or allowable. A deliberate response is a reply or reaction done consciously and intentionally. Domestic violence is the inflicting of physical injury by one family or household member on another. As the resolution asks if an action is morally permissible, I value morality, defined as conformity to the right rules of conduct. Since morality guides action, it must provide reasons that could actually obligate us, which is permissible only if it is derived from principles that we would willingly accept. Only a system that derives principles of mutual restraint from individual self-interest accounts for this fact, as David Gauthier notes. Moral principles are introduced as the objects of agreement among persons for the adoption of moral rules and actions. Since they agree to constraints on their choices, restraining their pursuit of their own interests, they acknowledge a distinction between what they may and may not do. They recognize a place for mutual constraint and so for a moral dimension in their affairs. Consequently, the criterion is contractarianism, Gauthier continues. A contractarian theory demonstrates the rationality of impartial constraints on the pursuit of individual interests to persons who may take no interest in others' interests. Morality is thus given as sure grounding in a widely accepted conception of practical rationality. No alternative account of morality can accomplish this. Thus, contractarianism provides a rational basis for individuals to mutually restrain their actions, creating social contracts with other individuals or governments in order to form society. Only such a system provides a non-circular origin for and a way of achieving morality. Contention 1. The use of deadly force in response to domestic violence is a legitimate use of self-defense. Indeed, the right to self-defense is pre-political, stemming from a natural interest in self-preservation and existing before and continuing beyond the formation of social contracts, as Kimberly Furzan elaborates. Imagine that a state did not allow citizens to use deadly force against culpable attackers. It is hard to believe that such a state would last for long. Citizens would have no reason to defer to an institution that failed to protect them. Self-defense provides the very condition for the willingness of individuals to leave the state of nature, and the scope of duty to the sovereign is limited by the latter's ability to fulfill that purpose. Furthermore, the use of deadly force serves as a response to imminent violence, as Furzan continues. When an attack against private individuals is imminent, the police are no longer in a position to intervene and exercise the state's function of securing public safety. The individual right to self-defense kicks in precisely because immediate action is necessary. Individuals do not cede a total monopoly of force to the state. They reserve the right when danger is imminent and otherwise unavoidable to secure their own safety against aggression. Victims of repeated incidences of domestic violence, who are essentially hostages, are subject to constant threats to their lives and thus are also able to assess the potential actions of their abusers, as noted by Joan Kraus. Out of sheer instinctual self-preservation, a battered man or woman must become highly sensitive to his or her abuser's behavior and must learn to read the cues of an impending attack. In addition, it is not quite accurate to say that a sleeping abuser, for example, poses no threat. Unless actually comatose, a sleeping abuser is merely seconds away from being an awakened abuser. Abusers tend to sleep lightly, demand that their partners be present when they awaken, and resume the abuse immediately. Thus, even when forming a social contract, individuals retain an inviolable right to defend against aggression. Consequently, the use of deadly force as self-defense in response to domestic violence conforms to contractarian principles, thus rendering it morally permissible. Contention 2. Alternatives to deadly force are often unavailable or counterproductive. Subpoint A. Attempting to leave an abusive relationship exacerbates abuse. Judith Coons elaborates. A decision or even a threat to leave can trigger lethal violence. Because domestic violence is marked by power and control, attempting to exit a room may be considered disobedience, spurring escalated violence. Resistance strategies may force an abuser to make his coercive power explicit. Any threat, however small to the abuser's authority within the family, is likely to be met with violence. According to the Department of Justice, 75% of assaults occur when the abused party is divorced or separated from the abuser. Another study indicates that 45% of murders of women arise out of a man's rage over the actual or impending estrangement from his partner. Subpoint B. Legal intervention is unhelpful and impractical. The state is often unable to solve for instances of domestic violence, as Alifair Burke furthers. Even if someone does call authorities, the police and courts often fail to protect from abuse. For example, mandatory arrest statutes also increase the likelihood that a domestic violence victim will be arrested for using defensive force. Even if a woman manages to leave her husband and secure a restraining order against him, the hurdles to enforcement of this order are considerable. A battered woman's past attempts to resort to the police, the courts, or other avenues of escape may have failed to protect her from additional and escalating abuse, leaving her with a reasonable belief that she has no safe options. Consequently, the lack of viable and practical alternatives only further reinforces the justifiability of the use of deadly force in self-defense against domestic violence, in turn supporting the contractarian upheld and moral right to self-defense. Contention 3. Repeat abusers violate the social contract, thereby forfeiting their right to life. As Schlomit Wallerstein elaborates, the defender's core right to not be killed prevails over that of the aggressor. Various accounts of the rights theory are based on the correlation between one's rights and the duties these rights impose on others. If an aggressor does not have an active right not to be harmed or killed, a defender is at liberty to harm or kill him. Through acts of aggression, aggressors forfeit their right to life, thus allowing defenders to harm and possibly kill them in self-defense. According to social contract theories, once an individual violates the social contract, they essentially re-enter a state of nature and therefore forfeit certain rights. The same principle allows for the imprisonment of criminals, for instance, who have forfeited their right to liberty. Hence, the use of deadly force against an abuser who has grossly violated the rights of another individual does not constitute as a contractarian violation and is thus morally permissible. So to summarize, the use of deadly force in response to domestic violence is ultimately morally justified through both the contractarian concepts of self-defense and rights forfeiture. Thus, I urge the judges for an affirmative ballot. Thank you.
So your argument depends on the social contract of some sort, correct? The contention 1 says that if a government fails in their duty to protect people, then the right to self-defense is triggered, correct?
Yes.
So
But it also exists absence of the state's ability to protect the people.
Why?
Because what the Ferzan card says is that essentially the right to self-defense exists before the creation of a social contract. And when individuals create that social contract, they do not
why does
lose
it
that
exist
right.
before the social contract?
Okay, what Ferzan essentially says is that it stems from all individuals' rights to life and autonomy. And so from the
Why do they have those rights?
Wait, why do they have what rights?
Life and autonomy.
Life and autonomy, because we're essentially looking towards something like human worth. And so, and even regardless of that, if you're looking towards morality, it's based on mutual restraint. Individuals would want the rights to life and liberty.
All right, so let's talk about your contractarian principles. So the Gaudier 1 and 2 arguments, they are very specific that we set up some sort of hypothetical contract, correct? It's not an actual social contract made by people to authorize the government, correct?
Okay, so what Gauthier is essentially saying is that moral principles are derived from this idea of agreement. And so contractarianism, I just used the Gauthier card to reinforce this, but you could also use Locke or Hobbes if you chose to.
Right, but Gaudier is very specific in that he says that we are talking about a hypothetical contract that purely rational people would come about if they were in if they weren't biased, correct?
Okay, well, Gauthier also says that because this hypothetical example is made real because individuals have the self-interest.
All right, so let's talk about your second contention, which says that there's no alternatives to using deadly force. Your first argument talks about how if they leave, they're more likely to be abused. But why does that mean that, that's triggering the right to self-defense?
Okay, what it simply means is that if you're trying to present the idea that there are multiple alternatives and so the ability to use defensive force is rendered null and void, the fact is that there aren't any alternatives.
All right, so I have a quick question. So your definition of deliberate says it's like some sort of intentional action, right?
Yes.
So when victims use deadly force, are they even though their goal is self-defense, aren't they intending harm to an individual?
Yes.
All right, cool. So your contention 3 talks about forfeiting your moral right once you've harmed an individual.
Yes.
If your action which forfeits that moral right is not an action that is freely yours, but is an action determined by something else, like a mental disease or something, then have you forfeited that moral right?
Could you clarify that?
All right, so if someone who's mentally disabled harms an individual, have they forfeited their moral right to life?
I would argue that even within the scope of the resolution, it would be very very limited to the resolution if you're going to argue that all abusers have some sort of mental illness.
Right, but I'm asking if that's true.
That case, it would be they'd have an excuse because they would use an insanity plea, for example, but that doesn't justify their behavior.
All right. is just going to be NCAC. Everyone ready? I value morality. Moral claims cannot be based on an objective reality, but must consider the subjective role of the observer. Nagel writes, something will be inevitably lost if we try to understand an experience from an objective viewpoint that is distinct from the subject of the experience. Even if we credit its perspectival nature, we will not be able to grasp its most specific qualities unless we imagine them subjectivity. We will not know how eggs taste to a cockroach, even if we develop an objective etymology of the cockroach's senses of taste. When it comes to values and goals, the gulf may be even more profound, for no objective conception of the mental world can include it all. Any objective reality must include an acknowledgement of its own incompleteness. It would have to include the qualification that the exact character of each of the intentional perspectives with which it deals can be understood only within the subjective imagination. We have not given up the idea that the world really is independently of how it appears to us. We have only given up the idea that this coincides with what can be objectively understood. The world includes experiences. There's no single point of view from which they can all be fully grasped. An objective conception includes that features of our own minds cannot be objectively grasped, or just an examples of more general subjectivity, of which other examples lie beyond our subjective grasp as well. Thus, we must maintain a consistency between our objective and subjective perspectives on the world in order to have a consistent and logically sound perspective on reality. To intend harm on an individual adopts a moral goal that subjectively conflicts with the objective statement of value. Nagel 2. When I twist an arm intentionally, I incorporate evil into what I do. It is my creation, and reasons stemming from it are magnified and lit up by my point of view. They overshadow reasons stemming from evils that are more faint, that do not fall within the intensifying beam of my intentions. To aim at evil is to have one's actions guided by evil. A falling off of evil becomes a reason for one altering what one does to ensure evil is restored. But evil should repel us. If something is evil, our action should be guided towards its elimination. When we aim at evil, we're swimming head on against the normative current. Our action is guided at that very point direction diametrically opposite to that which moral value of that goal points. If we aim evil, we make what we do a positive function of it. The intentional function is simply the moral function reverse. This produces an acute sense of moral dislocation. Therefore, my value criterion is consistency is not intentionally harming an individual. The resolution uses the term deliberate response, meaning the victim is conscious of the harm they're about to cause when they use deadly force. This is definitionally true. Phillips defines deadly force is defined as the force an actor used with the purpose of causing substantial risk or causing death or serious bodily harm. Insofar as using deadly force, as she conceives in Cross-Ex, forces the individual to adopt an intention which is opposite to the goals of morality, that's going to be inconsistent with the subjective nature of reality. Then let's go to the affirmative case. You can extend her definition of deliberate, which is very specific on the issue, saying that the victim would be conscious or would have the intention of their action. That's just going to give you more credence for the negative case. Let's go to her value criterion about contractarianism. First, her contractarian system of morality, there's no reason why that actually achieves morality. It just says that there are certain principles that rational, self-interested people would agree upon, but there's no reason why those are actual moral principles. But second, the social contract doesn't exist. When we see the development of states, they aren't like characterized by some sort of formal agreement between governments or between individuals in an anarchic state of nature. They're usually like powerful wars or some sort of like coercion involved. There's no social contract. But third, contractarianism can never achieve a link sufficient to morality because as a rationally self-interested individual, I could contract with another person to, for example, kill them, but that doesn't mean it's moral. But fourth of all, when I pressed her in questions in Cross-Ex about like what the basis of the contractarian system of morals was, she said that it's something to do with like autonomy and human worth. However, the social contract is oppressive because it sets up a legal system which oppresses one's ability to freely act however they want to. Let's go to the first contention, which talks about like the legal right to self-defense. First, there exists absolutely no warrant as to why the right to self-defense exists pre-politically prior to the social contract. When I asked her in Cross-Ex, she says that we're looking to like some conception of human worth and life, but there's no reason why that's necessarily true or why that's moral in the first place. That's just an unwarranted assertion. But second, I'd say under her own system of contractarianism, we would never contract to a system of rights or a system of self-defense which was not eminent, because that would allow people to like use self-defense or deadly force whenever they thought or perceived some threat as like some even minor threat, like poking someone in the eye, as a sufficient threat to their life. But third, finally, this argument begs the question of whether she's winning the social contract framework. Insofar as I've adequately responded to that, the first contention is going to go away. Then let's go to the second contention, which says that no alternatives exist. First, there's a bunch of alternatives. The incapacitated force, you can just knock the abuser and call the police or something. There's no reason why you have to automatically use deadly force. But second, there's social intervention programs which neighbors and other people can call upon when a family is, when they know that domestic violence is occurring, and they will actually go to the house and help those individuals. There's no reason why that individual has to actually leave. But third, this argument is just empirically denied. Abused women are able to leave a relationship, Schwartz writes. Battered women do get out, and they get out at a high rate. The divorce rate over 2 years ranges from 2 to 5% in the general population. In the study, 38% of the women married to abusers had left and divorced their husbands. That means that they can empirically leave their husbands without experiencing future abuse. But fourth, just because there's no alternatives doesn't mean that something is moral. For example, just because in war we have to kill innocent civilians as collateral damage doesn't mean that that was a moral action. Just because there's no alternatives to that action doesn't mean it's moral. Her argument is that governments don't care about domestic violence. However, this is an old argument. Now governments are starting to care. Mason writes, most police forces in the UK now have specialist domestic violence units or domestic violence coordinators. The police are also developing their procedures to simplify assessments of the risk offenders posed to their victims. That means that though in the past this may have been true, now most countries are developing police forces which are going to be able to effectively solve domestic violence. Let's go to the third contention. First, I'd say that individuals can't forfeit their moral right to self-defense if it's not a conscious decision they're making because they're not forfeiting it. It's because of something else inherent to them. But I'd say that abusers never forfeit their right to self-defense because their abuse is linked to mental illness. Richard Nealon writes, mental illness has been linked to domestic violence. The types of mental illness seen with domestic abuse are varied, and not of all people with the same diagnosis of abuse. Some have been tied to disorders such as border personality disorder or post-traumatic stress disorder.
Is everyone ready? Okay, so let's look at your first Nagel card, and he essentially says that our conception of morality is always going to be subjective, right?
Well, we have to include it's that we have to include a subjective account of morality
Okay,
in order
so then
understand.
so if there is a subjective account of morality, then how can we even determine that harming people is bad?
Right. That's where I was going to get to the specifics of the argument. The Nagel argument is not saying that there is no objective morality or there exists no objective, impartial understanding of reality. It says that we need to evaluate these subjective perspectives in order to attain a full understanding of that objective morality.
Okay, and so how exactly do we interpret these subjective standards of morality? What type of standards exactly are you?
We have to go into the mind of certain individuals and examine their intentions. The Nagel 2 evidence, for example, gives the example. When I when I take out a certain action which I'm intending, when I twist the arm of a child, I have some sort of intention in my mind from my subjective perspective, which is illuminated. But that intention, insofar as its goal is to harm an individual, is
Okay.
contrary to the goals of.
All right, so your value criterion and basically, I guess, your first contention is the idea that the affirmative allows individuals to be harmed, right?
No.
What
The
is it?
argument is that deadly force definitionally entails intentionally harming an individual, which, in conjunction with the Nagel 1 and Nagel 2 evidence, very specifically tell you is immoral.
Okay, all right, and so what happens if you intend to harm someone outside of the scope of domestic violence, for example? Say someone tries to beat me up. Am I then not allowed to essentially deliberate and decide to act in self-defense?
You can, but it's I'm saying that them intending to harm you was wrong. But if you also intend to harm them in retaliating with self-defense, that's wrong, right? You conceded in your last cross-ex that though the goal of the victim is self-defense, they still have the intention of harming the individual as a means to that end.
Okay, so essentially deliberate violence will always be wrong, right?
As long as the person is intending to harm that person,
Okay,
right?
so deliberate violence is always wrong.
Not necessarily, right?
So if
or
if the-
deliberate violence, yeah.
Yes.
Deliberate violence would always be wrong.
Okay, all right. Now, so when you present incapacitative force, for example, as an alternative, you're essentially saying incapacitate them so you can call for help and get them to leave eventually, right?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Now, how like, what proportion of individuals who, like, say, abuse their wives, like, how can you link that to mental illness?
The argument is that a lot of people who engage in acts of domestic violence, it is not due to like some sort of like reason they themselves adopt. It's due to some sort of empirically he does a study.
So then, like, what percentage is this?
He doesn't give like a specific empirical warrant or like empirical
No
like
empirical. Okay.
like of what percentage it is, but he says a lot of the cases of domestic violence, the abuser it's due to some sort of prior mental illness.
I'll just use prep time. Okay. So just an overview, it will be NCAC, starting with framework. I'll just address framework on both sides at the same time. All right, everyone ready? All right, start with the framework, and essentially his two Nagel cards give you a reason to prefer my own value structure. His two Nagel cards, the first one says that we need some objective, we need some sort of, to weigh some sort of subjective standard of morality, and his second Nagel card says that essentially evil is evil, at which point it begs the question, how do we know what exactly is an objective and what exactly is a subjective point of conception of morality, and how do we know what is right and wrong? And that's why you have to look towards the contractarian standard, because essentially the only way that we can reconcile this is through forming contracts in which you have mutual restraint. That's essentially what the two Gauthier cards says. And so I actually provide you the best way to determine and how to weigh these objective and subjective standards of morality through his two Nagel cards. Now, in response to his own value criterion, I would say that harming an individual, the deliberate harming of an individual, he doesn't establish why this is always bad. For example, you can clearly see how deliberately killing someone to save many other people, we would consider that morally permissible. And second of all, you can see clear instances of war in which individuals intend to kill other people, but somehow you achieve more justice. Take the example of World War II. We intended to kill the Nazis, but by doing so, we achieved greater morality by stopping the oppression of the Jews. So in terms of his own value criterion, he doesn't have a clear link to morality there. And second of all, I would say that he doesn't solve for this at all. You look towards contention two, subpoint A of the affirmative case, when you do not allow individuals to use deadly force, you're actually allowing harm to perpetuate in the negative world, which means that you're having more instances of harming an individual. So he doesn't even achieve his own standard. Go on to the affirmative case. If you're looking towards contractarianism, he says that there's no reason why it achieves morality. I already established this. We have to reconcile the objective and the subjective standards of morality somehow. Second of all, when he's talking about them not being formal agreements, you can see that you're still agreeing to restraints. That's what you have when you have revolutions. Individuals essentially believing that the government is not mutually restraining themselves and oppressing the people. Even if it's not like a formal handshake, I agree to the social contract, it still exists in principle. And finally, when he's talking about the legal system oppressing people through contractarianism, that isn't true contractarianism. I'm not violating the standard of contractarianism. It's just those societies agreeing not to mutually restrain individuals. Okay, so in terms of the Ferzan under contention one, when he says that I provide no warrant as to why it exists, what Ferzan says is essentially because individuals have this intention and this ability and they want life and they want autonomy, that's where self-defense comes from. Essentially, morality is based on our own subjective will. Because we want this, we essentially agree that we can use self-defense because otherwise individuals would be able to would be able to essentially infringe upon our life and our liberty without any restraint, and that's where the right to self-defense comes from. In terms of his response to imminence, you can see that that imminence is actually most topical because according to Alifair Burke, most battered women who kill their abusers do so during an impending attack, so I do conform to standards of imminence. In terms of standards to proportionality, you can see that Joshua Dressler says that more force can be used to prevent harm than can be used to punish. That's the reason why we're allowed to kill, for example, if someone's trying to kidnap or rape you. So in terms of proportionality, that doesn't link. In terms of the alternatives, the alternative that he presents only further links into contention to subpoint A. He says that we can use a capacitative force to leave, and what contention A says that even if these individuals can leave and they can receive social intervention, the violence is only going to escalate because the victims will find them again. Even if these women can be abused, essentially are able to leave, what the Department of Justice says is that 75% of these assaults occur when the divorce has already occurred. And so within that regard, he's not solving for domestic violence at all. In terms of rights forfeiture under contention 3, he's saying that individuals can't forfeit the right to self-defense. That's not what I was arguing. I was arguing that they instead forfeit the right to life. And in terms of abuse being linked to mental illness, he doesn't have any empirical analysis to say that the vast majority of these individuals suffer from a mental illness. And even if they do, that doesn't mean you eliminate the right to self-defense. And so within that regard, you can still affirm.
It's going to be negative case, then E affirmative case. Everyone ready? The reason that the AF is going to be losing the round is that she's totally misinterpreting the Nagel arguments, which are coming off the negative case. Let's go to Nagel 1. You can extend the Nagel 1 argument, which says that moral claims must be based on an objective reality, but we have to take into account the subjective reality of the individuals that morality accounts for. You can extend the argument that if we try to understand and experience from an objective point, we're going to inevitably exclude some of the most important details of that. For example, if you're trying to create an we will never know exactly how eggs taste to a cockroach, even if we develop a detailed objective account of a cockroach's senses of taste. That means any objective reality must include an account of its own incompleteness, and that the only way to ensure that we can actually understand objective reality is taking account all the subjective realities that constitute it. Her argument is that her contractarian system of ethics is consistent with this. However, I'd say first, the contractarian system of ethics doesn't take into account the subjective experience of an individual. It just says that we take into account their self-interest, but that's not taking into account the intentions or the intentions that they have. But then I say second, the contractarian principles that she's assuming, she's literally not taking into account their subjective interests insofar she assumes that they're all rational, self-interested people. She has an objective account of those persons and what they would agree to. So then go to Nagel 2. Extending Nagel 2 evidence, which says that because a moral reality must take into account these subjective perspectives, intending harm is always going to be bad. This is because when we intend harm to an individual, we are creating a subjective perspective on the world, which is always inconsistent with the objective moral claim. For example, when I'm intending harm to an individual, I'm using a subjective moral claim, which is contrary to the objective claim that harming an individual is bad. That means that that's always going to be inconsistent with understanding any sort of moral claim. Her two arguments in response to this are that first, there's no reason why this is always bad, but she just doesn't respond to the warrant in Nagel 2, which very specifically tells you that it'd be contrary to the objective conception of value to say that it's okay to intend harm. But then she gives the example of war and achieving more justice, but that just begs the question of whether reducing oppression and so forth are a necessary component of morality and justice. So you can extend the contention analysis, which she's conceded to, that deadly force definitionally entails intentionally harming an individual, insofar as that person is using a deliberate response to cause harm to that individual. Her only response to this is that she's cross-applying her subpoint A of the second contention, which says that I'm actually going to be allowing for future abuse. But my argument is that future abuse may also be wrong, but that doesn't mean that deadly force is right. Then let's go to the affirmative case. Go to their contractarian system of principles. Go to the second argument about how the social contract doesn't exist. You can extend the argument that the social contract doesn't exist because individuals, when we see the development of states or government systems, they aren't marked by some sort of agreement between individuals. They're just marked by coercion and force and war. Her argument is that it exists in principle, but that's not necessarily true. I never consented to the government. As soon as I was born, I was just essentially forced into the social contract. That doesn't mean that it exists in principle at all. Then you can extend the third argument, which is clean conceded, which means that contractarianism can never sufficiently achieve morality because as rational self-interested individuals, as like a mercenary, I might go into a contract with another individual to kill a person, but that doesn't mean that that's necessarily moral. Then let's go to her first contention. You can extend the first argument that there's no reason why the right to self-defense exists pre-politically. I specifically asked her why it exists pre-politically, i.e. prior to the social contract, and she just said it's based on some conception of like human worth or life, but she never warranted as to why those are relevant. So I will concede that the social contract might derive a right to self-defense, but insofar as I'm responding to the social contract argument, that right to self-defense is going to be irrelevant. So let's go to the second contention. She's just dropping a lot of critical arguments on the second contention, which is going to take away any sort of offense she has to self-defense. You can extend the third argument that empirically women safely do leave their abusers. The Schwartz evidence is very specific on this issue, that battered women in comparison to women who are not battered are able to safely get a divorce and separate from their husbands. That means that her argument, which relies upon the separation abuse and there being abuse after the person separates, is just empirically denied. But you can also extend the fourth argument, which is just going clean conceded again, which is that there's no reason why a lack of alternatives justifies any sort of morality. For example, we might have to kill innocent civilians during war, but that doesn't mean it's moral. But finally, the Mason evidence again goes clean conceded, which tells you that her argument might have been true a couple years ago, but now countries like the UK are developing police forces which are specifically trained in to deal with domestic violence. That means the social contract that means the social contract is never breached. Remember, she says you get the right to self-defense when the government doesn't protect individuals, but she's clean conceding this argument that now the government does protect individuals. Her argument is just straight old. So, at that point, those individuals don't have the right to self-defense, and all of her arguments are going to go away. Then, on the third contention, this argument, you can extend the argument that the empirical study that Nealon does, that the abusers are actually abused only because of mental illness like post-traumatic stress disorder. She says there's no empirical example, but he did an empirical study which says that it's not a conscious decision, which means that they don't forfeit their moral right.
Just 4 voters. Is everyone ready? So the first place where you can vote affirmative is essentially off of the framework, and he essentially accuses me of misinterpreting the Nagel cards, but there are multiple implications from the Nagel cards. First of all, he doesn't at all provide, when he says that harming an individual is wrong, we don't know what the subjective standard is. He doesn't say at all how it's objectively bad for us to harm individuals, and so within that regard, he himself fails the Nagel analysis because he's saying that morality is subjective and we have to take that into account. And likewise, you can also extend my argument that the only way in which we can take into account both the objective and subjective morality or perceptions of reality is through the social contract, when we have individuals and their different perceptions agreeing to mutually restrain each other. And that's the only way that you can actually fulfill his Nagel burdens. When he's talking about, for example, a contract killer agreeing to kill individuals and that fulfilling a social contract, that's not the case because you have to look towards the person that they're agreeing to kill. Obviously, there's no mutual restraint there, and so that's not even a contractarian standard. When he's talking about individuals are not actually fully agreeing to the social contract. The reason why the social contract still stands is because my opponent has clearly not tried to circumvent the law or overthrow the government. So he's essentially implicitly agreeing to abide by the social contract. So that's why I'm winning framework. He doesn't at all establish that harming an individual will always be bad. And so insofar as he fails to do that, there's no way you can even negate. He doesn't give you a reason to negate at all. He mentions that oppression, for example, oppression can be okay, but if he's talking about oppression, oppression itself is the deliberate harm of an individual. And so he's essentially conceding to that point when I'm saying that we can deliberately harm an individual to stop oppression. So that's a clear reason why I'm winning. The second reason why I'm winning is because because the oppression, he's actually making it worse in the negative world. If we're talking about the deliberate harming of an individual, he clearly links into contention to subpoint A that says that when individuals try to leave, you actually create more violence, you create more deliberate harm of an individual. And so at that point, when you're voting negative, you are always going to be deliberately harming more you're always going to be causing more deliberate harm to individuals. The third voter issue is the idea of self-defense. The Ferzan card says that individuals have an interest in not being harmed. This links back to a subjective standard of reality. Individuals want to be protected, they want to live. That's something that's always going to be the case. And so that's where self-defense comes from. Because individuals do not want to be deliberately harmed, they have the right to self-defense. And so insofar as that, I establish that self-defense is a standard that you can always look to. And when he's talking about the different alternatives, again, what his card says is that individuals can safely divorce. That doesn't mean that after the divorce has occurred, violence will stop. And so he clearly links again into contention to subpoint A, and again, that's another reason why you can vote affirmative. The fourth and final reason is because of rights forfeiture. He essentially mishandles that when he talks about the right to self-defense. He doesn't address why the right to life is actually forfeited through a contractarian principle, so you can extend the Wallerstein card that says it is. And likewise, his idea that we can essentially link everything to mental abuse doesn't, again, mitigate the idea of self-defense. I can still kill someone who's mentally insane trying to kill me.